Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
What we're going to do this morning is just some review of where we've been, because we're going to pause and take a break. And what we've looked at, the goal of the class has been trying to understand different strands, I would call them, strands of thought of Jewish ideas about God, as we kind of mull them over and see how they filter into the Siddur and try to formulate our own, every one of us, our own personal relationship with God and understanding of God, which I think is an important aspect of davening, although not everyone agrees with me about that. And we've spent a lot of time, I think about a year, talking about biblical ideas about God and rabbinic ideas about God. And I'm going to review today. Next week, as I said, Erev Shavuos, I think we're going to look at Akdamut, the piyut or poem, that we read on the first morning of Shavuot. And then we're going to take a break until after July 4th. So then we'll meet this week, we'll meet next week, and then the next time we'll meet, I believe, is July 9th, I think is what that Tuesday is. Okay? And so we're just going to take sort of the helicopter view of where we've been, and those of you who've been with us remember a lot of this. Unfortunately, I'm going to screen share, and I'm not as organized as I'd like to be, not as prepared and organized as I'd like to be. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, just sort of review, not read through them. We don't have time, obviously. Review all the handouts that we've had. Each one for each topic. Some of them have taken, 2 weeks to do, just to kind of review what we've been talking about over the last year. I am going to screen share. Okay. For whatever reason, I can't find, there's so many things that are not labeled. Okay. Well, I can't find Intro to Jewish Bible 1, but Bible 1 was talking about passages in the Tanakh that talk about God as having a physical presence. God is being embodied, seen, spoken to, etc. Session 2, we talked about God's presence described just as God's kavod, all right, generally associated with parts of the Bible that were concerned with priestly things. Doesn't talk about God's body or physical presence. Actually, session 1 was about how God can appear as a malach, a physical representation about God. Now it's coming back to me, right? God's body that you can actually see. The idea of God's kavod is vaguer than that, but it's still an idea that God has a presence somewhere as opposed to somewhere else, and that is generally associated with the Mishkan or the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. The idea that God feels present or is present at some places more than others. Then we looked at a more abstract idea, which we usually find in Sefer Dvarim and Deuteronomy, that actually God in general is not present with us at all. What we have of God is God's shem or name, which is kind of a more, I'm going to call it, abstract residue of God. That's what's present in our world. God is very far away. Very far away in Deuteronomy means in the Shamayim, in the heavens, okay? And God came to earth briefly and gave us words, divarim, instructions, mitzvot, Torah, however you want to put it. And all that we have on earth, we can't see God in the form of a malach, an angel, physical representation. We don't have God's kavod in any particular place. We just have dvarim. God has left a residue, and the residue is words or instructions. Okay? Okay. Then we had a couple of sessions about God's presence in nature, God as apprehended or grasped or experienced in nature. And we looked at two of those different ones. One was God's present in the power of nature. We looked at particularly something like Psalm 29, Havul Hashem b'nei Elim, God is in the storm, God smashes trees, God levels mountains. So the God in nature experience as the power of nature, the strength of nature. And then we looked at God as present in the beauty or the subtlety of nature. You could think a little bit of the first blessing of the Shema, which maybe straddles both of those ideas. I don't know. Or Psalm 104, the psalm that we will read Friday morning on Rosh Chodesh, which talks about God as present in all the manifold aspects of nature. All right. Then, this is where I ran aground here and didn't quite get it together in time. I don't know how to keep this file open without closing the whole thing. Then we talked about God in history, God as choosing to act in history, an idea that, of course, that's very familiar to us. Let's just say Az Yashir, right? God is splitting the Red Sea, or God is defending the Israelites, or having opinions about, human beings and wars and who should win and who should lose. We talked about God as judge. That was around high holiday time, right? That God has rules and moral instructions, and that if people generally, sometimes we talk about this as individuals, sometimes we talk about this as nations, okay? That God makes judgment. As individuals, you can think about Tachanun, right? The psalm that we say in Tachanun, Psalm 6. God, please don't punish me, okay? Or if we think about God of judge as groups, you could think of the second paragraph of the Shema from Deuteronomy, right? If y'all heed the mitzvot, then there will be food. And if you ignore the mitzvot, then there won't be food. Okay, so God is judge. Where are we? Then we talked about God in relationship with human beings. So we had, let me see if I can do this. Let me see what happens. No, that didn't. Okay. We had God loves humans, and God in relationship we saw very specifically in the prophetic sections of the Bible, the prophets. So we had God in relationship. God loves, and we had that mostly in the book of Hosea, right? God as lover, and the origin of the idea that God is like the husband and Israel is like the wife. In other words, using this is one way of understanding it, using the most intimate relationship of human beings, all right? As a metaphor for God's relationship with us. Sometimes it's as lovers. Sometimes it's as parent and child. We looked at God's relationship as potentially having anger, right? And we read from Heschel about, if you take seriously that God cares about people, then inevitably, if people don't do what they're supposed to do, God may be angry, right? Because if, Heschel's idea, if there's no anger, if there's no reaction when we do wrong, what that means is God doesn't actually care, right? And that anger is kind of an inevitable flip side of caring. The individual, so we talked about God in relationship to the individual. We see this a lot in the book of Psalms. And that might be, God, why is this happening to me? Or God, why are you doing this to me? Or a flip side of that, God, bad things are happening to me, and I know that I can rely on you to save me. But it's a very, as opposed to, let's just say, saving Israel or something like that, it's a very personal one-on-one relationship to God. And I think that's what so we talked about God in relationship to Israel or to a group in love, God's relationship to the group or individuals with anger, and God in relationship to me, will you save me, or I know you will save me. So we had a look at various ideas about God in the Bible. And, the Bible is the Tanakh has a vast corpus of literature, lots of different books, different themes. So one way of understanding this, of course, is that different people wrote different things and they had different ideas about God. Another way of understanding it is Maimonides' idea, which we'll come to when we talk about medieval ideas about God, that's ahead of us, that it's actually God is in a category of one, unique, fundamentally unlike anything else that we can encounter in the world. And therefore, it's impossible to say God is this or God is that. Rather, God appears, God is experienced in manifold, many different ways in different times and different situations. And all of these things are just approximations that our mind comes up with to try to say what God is, given that we can't fundamentally say what God is. We kind of just draw partial, limited conclusions based on our experience. Again, whether that experience is national, whether that experience is individual, whether that experience has to do with now, whether that experience has to do with something in history. So all of these, Rambam, Maimonides would say, by necessity, are partial, limited, fragmentary understandings of how God functions in the world, because all of our experiences of God are partial, limited, and fragmentary, and various passages in our literature, including various passages in the Siddur, will kind of touch on or reflect on these different aspects of God. So I want to pause for a moment. That was kind of the helicopter view of months and months of biblical theology. The rabbinic theology is fresher because we did it more recently. So I just want to pause for a moment and say, is there any question, comment, thought about any of that from any of the people who are actually physically here? All right. So if you missed any of those, all the talks are there. All the handouts are there. It goes back to the last week of April, and I'm going to work with Bert on labeling each one of those podcasts so that you can figure out what you're seeing. Okay. Then we moved ahead to the sages of the Mishnah and Talmud, Chazal, our sages of blessed memory. And again, now we're talking about the biblical period. We're talking about, I'm going to be extremely loose here, 1500 BCE to 400 BCE, 1,000 years before the Common Era. When we're talking about the rabbinic period, we're talking about the first few centuries of the Common Era, rabbinic literature. And sorry, I'm being clunky again because I haven't labeled these. Okay. So we started with God, the compassionate one. Now we said, and I just want to review this, just about all of these rabbinic ideas are based on passages in the Bible. It's not like they're brand new for the most part. It's rather that the sages of the Mishnah and Talmud felt that it was important to pull out certain ideas in the Bible, and I'm going to say, re-articulate them. So they kind of articulate them as principles or ideas, and then they will have certain proof texts from the Bible to support that. So it's not like they made these up from scratch, but somehow they're pulling together of materials, creates, I don't want to say a new, but a renewed and redefined definition of the idea. So we looked at, God as the compassionate one, and we talked about how one of the major purposes of that idea was to influence us just as God is compassionate, so we are supposed to be compassionate. And this draws a lot on ideas in the Bible of the king. One of the king's roles in ancient Near Eastern society is to be the one who defends the orphans and the widows, the weak and the downtrodden in society. And God, as king, takes on that role. And thus, we're meant to be compassionate. We looked at back to almost the first and second Bible sessions. We talked about anthropomorphic visions of God, prophets who said, yes, you can see God, and rabbinic ideas based on them that under certain conditions, God could actually be seen. And we had various stories. Now, it's fair to say always about midrashim. It's always fair to ask, did they really believe these midrashim? So Rabbi Ishmael, who goes, behind the curtain on the high holidays, who sees God, and God says this to him, and Rabbi Ishmael, he says, God says, Rabbi Ishmael, give me a blessing. And Rabbi Ishmael says, may your midat harachamim conquer your midat hadin. May your compassion conquer your strictness. So I think it's always fair to say about midrash, did they actually literally believe these midrashim? Were the sages aware that it's their kind of imagination at play? Or did they believe these things literally, particularly given that midrashim very often conflict with each other, right? And, to talk for politics for the moment, as the debate has been raging about religious views about redemption of captives, okay, versus fighting a just war, and religious authorities on all sides, I don't want to say versus, okay, but those two things, religious authorities on all sides cite various passages in rabbinic literature. Some critics of this have said, look, rabbinic literature is sprawling and vast, and you can always cherry pick and find what you want to find, right? So if you want to say God has a physical appearance and can be seen, you can cherry pick midrashim that support that. If you want to say God is far away and vast and lofty and cannot be physically apprehended ever, you can cherry pick midrashim that say that. So I think it's a fair question to ask always of rabbinic literature, of midrashim. Did they believe these things literally? I certainly don't know the answer. I know different people can have different opinions about that. But the fact is, midrashim, rabbinic stories about things very often conflict with each other. They conflict with each other. That would seem to suggest to us, well, they can't all be true, okay? Although, again, from Rambam's standpoint, Maimonides' standpoint, maybe they are all partial and limited apprehensions of a reality that's infinite and therefore can't be grasped in its totality. And so maybe they all have an aspect of truth in them, even though none of them is the whole truth. Is that a fair statement? I think that's a fair statement. So again, we'll see some things in Midrash which seem very, very fanciful, like Rabbi Ishmael inside the Holy of Holies sees God sitting on his throne and has a conversation with God, right? And does the Talmud really believe that? The rabbis who cite that story, do they really believe that literally? I don't know the answer. Okay, I just want to raise that question, okay? And this will apply to the next few sessions I'm about to review in a moment also, right? So then we had several sessions about God's internal complexity. Okay, so we talked about God as judgmental and strict, and we talked about God as compassionate, and how those two things are, you could call it, in conflict with each other, or sometimes balance each other. Feel free to jump in anytime. Okay, then we went to God's internal complexity. We also talked about how God manifests differently to people at different times. Again, you could say conflicting midrashim. God appears as a warrior, right? at the crossing of the Red Sea. God God's voice is loud. God's voice is soft. Everyone apprehends or perceives God differently, each one according to their own capacities. We also talked about God's complexity when it comes to Torah. How was the Torah revealed? The question of does anyone actually hear God's voice? Is God's voice non-specific, and Moses is the one who is interpreting and writing it down? So we talked about God's complexity in Revelation. We talked about God's complexity in Torah very closely. Okay, these are labeled, thank goodness. We talked about different ideas about Jewish chosenness. Okay, is that contingent or non-contingent? Meaning, are the Israelites chosen, beloved by God for no particular reason? Is it arbitrary, or is it contingent based on our doing mitzvot? Closely related to that, why can't I scroll down here? Scroll down. We talked about ideas. I think I have to, ideas of reward and punishment. I know what's missing behind that, so I'm just going to minimize that. We talked about God's, ideas of God's as doing reward and punishment. Again, whether it's individual, whether it's group things, as we see in second paragraph of Vayayim Shamoah. And then we talked about, rabbinic ideas about the afterlife. That is something that is greatly amplified in the sages, much more than it is in the Bible. So I said when I started out that in general, the sages don't come up with a lot that's new. They rather reorganize things, and that makes it seem new. But their emphasis on the afterlife is, I would say, relatively new relative to the Bible. And then the last thing we looked at is, in keeping with that, is rabbinic views of heaven and hell, right? Paradise and Gehenna. The righteous go to Gan Eden, Garden of Eden, paradise, where they get great things, great meals, and the wicked go down to Gehenna, Gehinnom, or medium people are subjected to torments of Gehinnom for a year to work off their sins, and then they're released from that. So we concluded rabbinic thinking with that. Rather, it wasn't a great last session. Sorry, I apologize about that. And a lot of people found that not very uplifting, and we don't really believe this stuff, and I can't believe you're teaching this. But again, in terms of completeness and understanding the thinkings of the sages, Chazal, and we know that in modernity we have to wrestle with all of these ideas that contemporary Jews wrestle with. The classical rabbinic ideas about Israel as God's chosen people, the idea of God as judge, the idea of reward and punishment, the idea of an afterlife. So all of these are things that contemporary Jewish theology is going to wrestle with, because they are less in keeping with general contemporary ideas. So what we're going to do after the break, after July 4th, is we're going to move forward and look at various ideas about God in the Middle Ages. We'll look at sort of two contrasting, I hesitate to call them schools, I'll put it in air quotes, but two contrasting approaches, which are philosophy and Kabbalah. And then we'll go to modernity and look at modern and contemporary Jewish theologians and see how they try to make sense of all of these things, right? So we've looked at biblical and rabbinic ideas about God. We're going to move forward to medieval philosophy and medieval Kabbalah, and then modern ideas about God. And those two things are what we're going to do looking forward after July 4th, right? So I wanted to review just to look at where we've been over the last year. So we've looked at, and if any of this piqued your interest and you weren't there all along, all of that is there starting the last week in April 2023. It's all available online. Michael first, and then there's another hand. Michael.
Yes. Despite the fact that you say that people don't want to believe about the afterlife and Gehinnom and so forth, yet that has become the basis for our mourning practices. People say Kaddish for 11.
Yeah. Well, I want to argue with that about the basis. All customs, religious anthropologists, I guess, will say to you that all religious customs are multi-determined, meaning there are multiple reasons. So you could say, as we have studied together, that yes, an early reason that is given for saying Kaddish for a certain amount of time is because the soul is wandering around in purgatory and we're trying to do mitzvot for the merit of the soul. But if you said to most people, why do you say Kaddish? I don't know that most people would say that. So just because I had a teacher who referred to this as the genetic fallacy, just because a custom originates for some reason doesn't mean that that's the reason that people do it. The simplest example being, we knock wood because it has something to do with Jesus's cross. That's the original reason, apparently, for I'm not sure that's going to happen, so knock wood. And if you ask the vast majority of Americans, what does knocking on wood mean when you say you hope for the future? The vast majority, including, I think, religious Christians, would not say that it has to do with because you're knocking on Jesus's cross, right? So that's a good example of the genetic fallacy. Just because there is an origin to a custom, a religious custom, a folk custom, whatever you want to call it, doesn't mean that's the reason that people do it. There are usually multiple reasons that people do it. And very often the reason is, I don't know, or because that's how we do it, because that's what was handed down to me, because that's what the family or the group says we do. I don't know. Why do you come and say Kaddish? Because you're supposed to. Because my parent did for their parent, so I'm doing it for my parent because I'm supposed to, right? So all kinds of reasons are given, and most people who are saying mourners Kaddish, I warrant, are most Orthodox people. Torah true, Shomer Shabbos, keep kosher, keep family purity laws, Orthodox, card-carrying Orthodox Jews probably are not thinking about the soul of their loved one in purgatory and I'm winning a mitzvah point for them, while they're saying Kaddish. Sorry, it's a long-winded answer, Michael. Right. So by the way, Anne, I just want to add, and different people believe different things at different times. Different people in the same room believe different things about why we're saying Kaddish, for example, or what the second paragraph of the Shema means or doesn't mean. Different people believe different things. Different people believe different things at different moments in their life. Different people believe different things with different capacities. You've got, the rational, skeptical lobe of your brain. You've got the emotional attached to certain I want to be very careful, less sophisticated, parts of your brain. We are complex beings. We have multiple capacities. We believe multiple things. We believe different things in our lives. The organism of the minyan, different people in the room believe different things. So I think it's never as simple as X means Y. The purpose of today was just summary, overview, by the way, someone might say, well, you missed this important biblical idea about God, or you missed that important rabbinic idea about God, about which I might say, well, you're probably right about that. I'm abrahamhavivi@gmail.com. Feel free to send me an email if you want, if you think I missed something really significant. And if I agree with you, then I will try to, backtrack and include a session on that. So I guess my overview of biblical and rabbinic ideas about God, while I do not claim it's 100% systematic. I would certainly claim it's not totally random. And I really try to hit what I thought were the highlights. So next week we'll talk about Akdamut, the Aramaic poem that we recite on the first morning of Shavuot, and then a few weeks off until after the 4th of July.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.